Hi, thanks for joining us. My name is David Penn. I'm a research analyst with the Finovate group. Joining me today is Dave Birch. He's an author, ambassador, and part of Consult Hyperion. He's going to talk to us a little bit about the organization, the work he does for them, and some of the work he does revolving around digital identity management. Dave, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
First, let me just ask you, how have you found the conference so far, down here on day one?
It's been great. I mean, I have to say, at 9 o'clock, it wasn't looking so good because flights were being delayed.
Oh, it was crazy.
It was crazy stuff, but you know, sometimes things just have the right atmosphere to them.
Yeah.
And it's been really interesting. I mean, because I'm curious to see the new fintechs that are here and what's going on.
Sure.
And just walking around chatting to people, it's been great.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Well, by way of introduction, for those who might not be familiar with you and your work, could you tell us just a little bit about Consult Hyperion?
Sure. Consult Hyperion is a specialist electronic transactions consultancy.
Okay.
So we advise big clients on population scale transaction systems.
Oh.
So we work on things like mass transit, you tap in your card on
Right.
TfL, chip and pin rollout for big banks, electronic payments for the big schemes. So mass market stuff.
Oh, interesting, interesting. Well, one of the things I wanted to talk with you about was digital identity, something
Yeah.
you've been almost synonymous with for quite some time. You did a keynote address on that a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
I'm wondering maybe some top-line takeaways from that discussion.
Well, I mean, my point really was, a long time ago, it was the theorists who said, you know, we're going to have to do something about identity. And then a few years ago, it was technologists like me who'd kind of run into the buffers and said, we can't make any more progress unless we do something about identity. But now, and this is what my presentation was about, now it's people like Mark Carney, who was the governor of the Bank of England, saying, you know, we can't make any progress without doing something about digital identity.
Interesting.
So it's gone up the agenda. But my point was, it's not just technologists that are saying it, it's people who understand the financial system that are saying it. It's become a priority. And of course, because of my heritage, I feel banks would have a role to play in fixing that problem.
Wow, that's interesting the way that you described that. The first book of yours that I remember reading was Identity is the New Money.
Oh, thank you.
And one of the things I thought, that was about 6 years ago when you wrote that one. And I'm particularly curious about how you feel the conversation has evolved. You sort of alluded it to a second ago on the topic of digital identity and digital money. Has that conversation progressed in ways that you thought it would, or has it been surprising some of the ways it's developed?
No, I mean, look, it's a common criticism of technologists that we expect things to happen more quickly, but we sometimes underestimate the impact of things when they do happen.
Okay.
So it's been a little disappointing to me that we haven't made more progress. It still drives me crazy having to enter all of my personal details every time I want to do something new online. But on the other hand, I think it's been recognized that the impact of the transition to a real digital identity infrastructure is going to be so great on the rest of society and the economy that we need to think it through and get it right.
Sure.
So pluses and minuses.
Yeah. And again, I thought it was very fascinating as you sort of scaled it up from technologists and all the bankers being interested in it, showing at least some development of awareness, perhaps, at a minimum, that might help hasten that a bit.
Well, look, the argument is that a lot of the guys here are talking about fintech.
Right.
And in terms of, I mean, the goal, which is to reduce the cost of financial intermediation, it's getting asymptotic. Like we're getting as far as we can get with fintech. We've already cut the costs of transactions, increased the speed of transactions. I mean, like we can't get any further with fintech. The costs that are out of control are the reg tech costs. It's compliance, it's know your customer, anti-money laundering. If we really want to make an impact on costs, we've got to attack those costs. And I think the message came through from the panel this morning, which actually I thought was pretty interesting. If we really want to do something about that, we have to start talking about artificial intelligence.
Right.
But it still doesn't make any sense unless you have some kind of digital identity infrastructure. Because how do I know who you are? How do I know you're authorized to access this information? How do I know you're allowed to control this account? You see what I mean? Like it's infrastructural.
Right.
So I understand the overall dynamics and where people have to invest to really make a difference to the cost-benefit analysis.
Right.
But we can't do that without some kind of identity infrastructure. And I was winding them up a bit because it's conference rhetoric. But if the banks don't do something about it, the problem isn't going to go away.
Right.
So somebody else will fix it. And of course, that somebody else will be Facebook, Apple,
Exactly.
Google, Amazon, and that would be problematic on the banking side, I think, because it would sit between banks and their customers.
Yes.
Anyway, that's what we were talking about.
Right, interesting. That is definitely one of the themes that I've noticed a number of some of the more interesting conversations talking about. If banks aren't careful, they're going to find that their relationship that's going to be interceded, that there's going to be somebody else in between them if they don't get between them and their customers. So I thought that was really interesting. One of the things also I wanted to talk to you about was when you talk about these sort of things, there's sort of an optimism that you have and looking forward, which I think is really refreshing. And also I find interesting that for technological advance, you've referred to this sort of thriving digital identity management regime as taking us back to our roots, which that was sort of an interesting way to refer to technological advancement as taking us back. Can you kind of explain what you mean by that?
I mean, because this is before we had the kind of urban anonymity of the Industrial Revolution. Things were based on relationships, like whether I trusted you, whether I wanted to lend you money. And we scaled away from that, and we had institutions as intermediaries. But the new technology, because we're connected all the time, in a weird kind of way, we're going back to that. So if I want to know whether I can trust you about, it's like we're connected. I could go on LinkedIn right now and find somebody that knows both of us. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So oddly, in a way, those new interconnections are actually taking us back. And if you're trying to get the big picture stuff, I like to look at what the social anthropologists say rather than what the technologists are saying. And those guys are very into this idea that we live in these clans with relationships. There's something more human about that. So yes, so I think the technology basing identity on relationships, the reputations we establish from those relationships, that is more interconnected.
Yes. Yeah, very, very interesting. And it also reminds me in some ways, obviously Identities and New Money refers to that, but your larger book, Beyond Bitcoin, Beyond Babylon, I think really kind of gets into some of that, the depth of that history of the relationships, the evolution of these sort of things. But you talked about the idea that before the intermediaries really became dominant, that it was very much relationship based. You knew who was in your tribe, you knew who was in your area.
That's why my argument is, if the new technology, if we're right, if the new technology is taking us back in that, where does it take us to? What kinds of communities will we exist in? Now, of course, when we're talking about the Neolithic clan, that was a geographic thing. Whereas nowadays, we're all in lots of overlapping communities of one kind and another. But the idea that our reputations could be forged in those communities, that the values that we share will lead us to form these communities, that the transactions we get involved in, the money that we use, will somehow reflect those values. To me, that seems like a very positive vision of the future. So I'm quite excited about the possibilities.
Yeah, it does very, very interesting stuff. I want to talk one last thing that you were involved in earlier today, and that was was a panel that you were moderating on financial crime and new technologies. Sort of a provocative topic tackled provocatively, I thought, which was kind of entertaining to start us off with. What was your thinking about how you wanted to handle that conversation, and what was your takeaway from the conversation? Do you think that you were able to get out of it what you wanted?
I thought it was a funny idea to say to the panelists, okay, I want to get better at crime, so which crime should I avoid? Like which crimes are you guys tackling with your technology? I thought that was a funny idea to do that. I'm not sure the humor translated perfectly. But where that conversation ended up, I thought was very clear. So we talked about all of the new technologies, blockchain and quantum computing and biomet, and what those mean for financial crime. And I think we came to the pretty clear conclusion that the most important technology by a long way was artificial intelligence. And the message I took from that discussion was we somehow have to kind of take the ethics of this a bit more seriously, which means people like me having to learn to communicate with people who understand ethics. Which is not thanks. So I shouldn't make that joke.
I think it went well in the room. I think people got it.
What I took from the conversation was that if we're going to move forward, we need to somehow deal with ethics in a much better, much more structured way, partly by having conversations with people that understand those things more than we do.
Right.
But maybe we do have to, as the panel said, maybe we do have to start thinking about some codes of conduct, some basic rules for doing business in that world. Because obviously the criminals are going to get AI as well.
Sure.
And we need to tilt the balance.
Right. Just establishing new norms and things like that. I think sort of by conclusion, one of the things I found really fascinating about what you've said and things I've been starting to read from technologists is increasing interest and understanding of how the importance, you mentioned social anthropology, you mentioned ethics, things that are not necessarily technical topics, increasingly being very important for technologists to sort of close that gap. Took that asymptotic movement for us to finally close that final gap is going to maybe rely on, going to force us to rely on some aspects and fields that are beyond technology and are into some of these other fields, sociology, anthropology, to maybe finally figure out how to do it.
If that kind of more optimistic view about technology, I mean, I know this sounds a bit idealistic, but if that view that about technology interconnecting us,
right.
McLuhan's Global Village, so if that is right, then we need to evolve some new norms and etiquette for functioning together. And like at the moment, we're kind of stuck. So we have the new technology like Facebook and things like that, but somehow we're not using it properly yet. It's like we haven't normalized, we haven't used it properly.
Right.
But yes, I'm fundamentally technologically optimistic.
Yeah, it definitely seems like that's the case. We get the brand new toy, we're playing with it, whatever. Then all of a sudden we realize we've been playing with it all day. We haven't eaten, we haven't slept, and we got to kind of go back and sort of check ourselves a little bit. And I wonder if that's sort of what is inevitably what would happen with technology.
Well, what we want is technology in financial services that improves the overall financial health of consumers.
Right.
We've gone past reducing transaction costs.
Right.
This is a much bigger picture. And to achieve that, we need to bring in more disciplines. We need to do it in a more structured way with that ethical underpinning.
Right.
But we need to have some kind of optimistic vision about where we want that to go.
Right.
And I just feel, if you look at all of the technologies, or you look at what these guys are doing here today, AI dominates everything. Once you get into the medium term, AI takes over. Yeah. We have to get that right.
Yeah, indeed. That makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you very much for joining us. A great little conversation.
It was great talking to you.
I enjoyed the presentations this morning, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference this week.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for joining us.